Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well and also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our basically it's our high school lesson on simple, compound, complex and compound complex sentence, right? So it is high school advanced writing, but we will be focusing specifically on grade 8, right? Or let's say our tutorial lesson we were doing on grade 8. And before we start our lesson, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 8, because as much as it's high school, but we're focusing on grade 8. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the lesson of simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. All right. So we said our chapter is simple, compound, complex, and compounds complex sentences. Our subject is English, which is language arts. Grade 8, we can say grade 8, but it is high school advanced writing. And then our lessons that we are going to be focusing on is a sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? And then we are going to identify dependent and independent clauses. All right. And we are doing our tutorial lessons on aplusstudents.ca. All right, so let's go on to our tutorial lesson now. We start our lesson where we are going to say, is the sentence a simple sentence? Is a sentence a compound sentence, a complex sentence, or is it a compound complex sentence? So during the lesson, we are going to find out the differences between a simple, compound, complex, or compound complex sentence. All right. So a clause, right? So we're going to start with a clause. So a clause is a group of words that contains both a subject as well as a predicate, right? Then we have independent clauses as well as dependent clauses, right? And an independent clause is a complete thought that can stand alone as a sentence. And to make it more easier, think of mm, think of somebody that's independent, right? Somebody who's independent, they stand on their own, they got their own thing going, right? So think of a sentence as an independent clause, for example, as someone or something that can stand on its own. It's a complete thought and it can stand alone as a sentence. Then we have a dependent clause. And if we were to make a realistic or reality example of a dependent clause, think of somebody who's dependent on someone else. Let's say, for example, as kids, right? Or children, youngsters, teenagers, you depend on your parents, right? So that's a dependent clause. A dependent clause is not a complete thought and it cannot stand alone as a sentence, right? Which means that you still need your parent for the daily day to day things, right? It's going to be very hard for you to stand on your own because when it comes to toiletries, when it comes to food, when it comes to certain things, you basically still need your parents, right? So that is almost examples, live examples that I can make between a independent clause as well as a dependent clause. So once again, an independent clause, it's a complete thought and it can stand alone as a sentence. And then we have a dependent clause, and this is not a complete thought, and a dependent clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. For example, the oranges on our tree are ripe. So the oranges on our tree are ripe. So if we look at this specific sentence, right, the oranges on our tree are ripe, then we can say this sentence, right, is an independent clause. And it can stand on its own, right? It can stand alone as a sentence, right? Because it has a subject, which is the oranges, and it has a predicate, right? So it basically tells us what it is doing, right? Then, after we pick up Kevin from work, after we pick up Kevin from work, dot, 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 and then, right? So now the question is, after we pick up Kevin from work, and then, so which means that this is not a complete thought, so this is a dependent clause. And it is missing something, right? So we said a dependent clause, it cannot stand on its own, which means that it will probably need the assistance of an independent clause. All right. So once again, a clause is a group of words that contains both a subject, it tells us who or what we are talking about, and a predicate, it tells us the action that takes place within that sentence. And we spoke about an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And an independent clause can stand on its own. It has a complete thought, which means that it has both subject as well as a predicate. And then we have a dependent clause, right? It does not complete a it does not have a complete thought, and it cannot stand alone as a sentence. It's either missing a subject or it's missing a verb. It's not a complete thought. Then we have our simple sentences. Then we have our simple sentence. And simple sentence, it is made up of a single independent clause. Remember we said it is an independent clause. It has a complete thought, right? And it can stand on its own, which means that a simple sentence, right, it's made up of a single independent clause, meaning it has both subject as well as predicate, and it can stand on its own. And an example of a simple sentence is Ben and I, which is our subject, spent all day relaxing at the pool. So relaxing is our predicate, right? So this has both subject as well as a predicate. And then again, also some simple sentences, they have introductory phrases. But the introductory phrases is part of the predicate. For example, in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. So in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. Or we can say Ben usually wears his heavy coat in the winter. Whether we first use the introductory phrase or we don't, or we just start with our subject, either way, both of those sentences are correct. It is a simple sentence, right? It has a single independent clause and it can stand on its own. It has both subject as well as a predicate. All right. Now we're going on to our compound sentence, right? And a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses. Remember we said an independent clause can stand on its own. It has a complete thought. It has both subject as well as a predicate. But now a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, meaning two clauses that can stand on its own. And then it is also joined by a coordinating conjunction. And a coordinating conjunction is words such as and, but, or so. Right? So which means that we have these two independent clauses that can both stand on its own, both have a complete thought, both have both subject as well as a predicate, but they are also joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is either and, but, or so. And an example of a compound sentence is, we saw the flash of lightning. So that is a sentence that can stand on its own. Here we have our subject, and here we have our predicate. Seconds later, we heard a rumor, a rumble of thunder. We have our subject, we have our predicate, right? But in order to join those two sentences, right, we have the coordinating conjunction, which is and. So and is our coordinating conjunction that's joining these two independent clauses. And we call that a compound sentence. A compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is either and, but, or so. And then we have a complex sentence. We have a complex sentence. And a complex sentence, right? It is made up of an independent clause and it is made up of a dependent clause. So it has both independent clause as well as a dependent clause in one sentence. And the dependent clause, right, within this complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. Remember, there's a difference between a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions are words that we use in order to join maybe sentences or phrases, right? And the coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or so. And then we have a subordinating conjunction. And subordinating conjunctions are words such as after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while. Right? So that is a difference between a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. So within a complex sentence, right, which is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause, right? This complex sentence usually begins with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, right? And I just went over what the subordinating conjunction is or what subordinating conjunctions are. And then a relative pronoun, it is words such as which, whom, who, and whose. So it includes words such as which, who, whom, or whose. Example, if she ever gets a chance, Terry would love to visit the Egyptian pyramids. And if we look at that word if is a subordinating conjunction. So if is a subordinating conjunction, which means that our first sentence is a dependent clause, and then the second sentence is then our independent clause. And then we have, during his trip to Italy, Tony visited the Trevi Fountain, which is in Rome. And this sentence, especially with the word which, is our relative pronoun. All right, so far we went over a clause and we said a clause has both a independent as well as a dependent clause, right? And an independent clause, it completes a thought and it can stand on its own. It has both subject as well as a predicate. Then we have a dependent clause, right, which cannot stand on its own, right? And it does not complete a thought, meaning it's either missing a subject or it's missing a verb. Then we have a simple sentence. And we see the simple sentence, it's made up of an independent clause, right? And we said an independent clause can stand on its own and it completes a thought and it has both subject as well as a predicate. And then we have a compound sentence, right? And a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, which is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And a coordinating conjunction is words such as and, but, or so. And then we have a complex sentence, right? And that is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause within that sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. And I say there's a difference between a coordinating conjunction as well as a subordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions are words that joins either sentences or clauses, and it's words such as and, but, or, so. And then we have a dependent clause, or let's say we have a subordinating conjunction. And a subordinating conjunction, right? It's usually the beginning of the sentence, and it's words such as after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, and while. So complex sentence is either made up of an independent clause that can stand on its own or a dependent clause, right, that cannot stand on its own and that usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. Or a dependent clause that usually starts with a relative pronoun. And a relative pronoun includes words such as which, who, whom, or whose, and that. All right, then lastly, we have a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence, it is made up of two or more independent clauses, right? Clauses that can stand on its own, that expresses a complete thought, right? That has both subject as well as a predicate. And a compound complex sentence has one or more dependent clause. And remember, dependent clause, it cannot stand on its own. All right, and if we look at an example, right, it says, after Samantha left work, she stopped at the bank and then went to the gym. So after Samantha left to work, that is a starts with a sub that starts with a dependent clause. After Samantha left for work, she stopped at the bank and then she went to the gym. Or we can say sometimes a dependent clause is or dependent clause in a complex sentence can interrupt an independent clause. For example, orcas that are kept in captivity often have bent dorsal fins. All right. So we went over what the dependent and independent clause is, simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, as well as a compound complex sentence. Now we're going to aplusstudents.ca and we're going to our first lesson, which is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? All right. So we basically went over most of the, actually, we literally went over all of the different types of sentences, right? We spoke about a simple sentence, which has a independent clause. Spoke of a compound sentence, which is made up of two independent clauses and that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. Spoke about a complex sentence, which is made up of a dependent as well as an independent clause. And the dependent clause, it begins with words such as after, if, before, and so on, as well as a relative pronoun, which is which, whom, whose. And then we said we have a compound complex sentence, which is also made up of both a dependent clause as well as an independent clause. All right, so now we're going to look at our sentence. Then we're going to say which type of sentence it is. If it's a simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, or compound complex sentence. The production of a single pound of honey requires nectar from approximately 2 million flowers. So we need to say that is a simple sentence, compound sentence, complex or compound complex sentence. All right, and if we were to identify what type of sentence it is, then we will say it is a simple sentence. So we will say that this is a simple sentence. All right, if we look at the next sentence, it says, if we can't find an expensive hotel for the 4th of July weekend, we can always stay with my parents. If we can't find an inexpensive hotel for the 4th of July weekend, we can always stay with my parents. So we need to say which type of sentence it is: a simple sentence, compound sentence, complex, or compound complex sentence. And if we specifically look at the first word of that sentence, it starts with if, right? And we can say this is a complex sentence because it has both a dependent as well as an independent clause. And we said a dependent clause, it starts with a subordinating conjunction, and one of the words of the subordinating conjunctions are if. Since 1923, the United States Flag Code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. So since 1923, the United States Flag Code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. So we need to say if it's a simple sentence, compound sentence, complex, or compound complex sentence. All right, and if we were to choose the correct one, we'll say that this is a simple sentence, right? It has a complete thought and it has a dependent clause. So this is a simple sentence. All right, let's go to our test. So we're beginning test. Which type of sentence is this? If we can't find an expensive hotel for the 4th of July weekend, we can always stay with my parents. We need to say if it's a simple, compound, complex, or compound complex sentence. All right, and if we were to choose the correct one or the correct sentence, the right type of sentence, because if we look at the first word, it's if, then we can say this is a complex sentence. And a complex sentence is correct. Annual plants survive only one season and must be replaced each year. But perennials return each year with new flowers and foliage, right? And if we look at the word but, if we look at the word but, right, we said that with a complex sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses and it is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is but, and, or so. So we can say this is a compound sentence that is joined by coordinating conjunction. So we need to say which type of sentence this one is. It says the right hemisphere of the human brain typically controls muscle movement on the left side of the body. So the right hemisphere of the human brain typically controls muscle movements on the left side of the brain. And if we were to say which type of sentence this is, right, we'll say this is a simple sentence. And a simple sentence is correct. So since 1923, the United States Flag Code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. So since 1923. And if we were to choose the correct sentence, since 1923, the United States flag code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. I think this is a simple sentence. Either, yeah, or, and it is a simple sentence. So the platypus, right, has venom producing glands which are rare amongst mammals. But its venom is not generally lethal or lethal to humans. And if we were to choose the correct type of sentence, is it simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? We'll say it's a compound sentence. The word but joins that two sentences. Oh, it's actually a compound complex sentence. All right. But we have our word but also there to join the words or sentences. So now we're going to identify dependent as well as independent clauses. And remember, we said a dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It doesn't express a complete thought. It's either missing a subject or it's missing a predicate, right? So we said a dependent clause, it cannot stand on its own, doesn't express a complete thought, whereas an independent clause can stand on its own and expresses a complete thought, has both subject as well as a predicate, right? And we said that, of course, a clause, it has both subject as dependent and independent clauses. Dependent clause, right, usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, and I'd mentioned the words of the conjunctions or the subordinating conjunctions. And remember, there's a difference between subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions are words such as and, but, or so. And subordinating conjunction includes words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, while, right? Those are dependent clauses. All right. So we need to select a dependent clause, a dependent clause. It says, because no rain has ever been recorded there, or do we say the center of Atacama Desert? And if we select the and we will say dependent clause because no rain has ever been recorded there. And that is correct. And it even starts with a subordinating conjunction. We need to select the dependent clause. Since Mr. Duran been sick all week and may still have been contagious. Or we just say since Mr. Duran had been sick. So since Mr. Duran had been sick all week and may still have been contagious. And if we were to select the dependent clause, let's say since Mr. Duran had been sick all week and still has been. So it's basically the first one, not the second one. And now we need to select the independent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause can stand on its own. It expresses a complete thought, both subject as well as a predicate, right? After a lightning bolt passes through the air, the compression and subsequent rapid expansion of the air molecules produces the booming sound of thunder. So we need to, it's either that whole sentence that is a dependent clause or only air molecules produces the booming sound of thunder. All right. All right, so this is the end of our lesson on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentence. We said a simple sentence has an independent clause, basically. An independent clause can stand on its own, right? It expresses a complete thought and it has a subject as well as a predicate. Then we have a compound sentence that is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is and, but, or, so. Then we have a complex sentence, right, which is made up of a dependent clause as well as an independent clause. And our depending clause, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And remember, subordinating conjunction, it's maybe words like after, because, if, and so on, right? All right, so that is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, complex, and compound complex sentences. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good day further. Goodbye.